The Galactic Military Academy's War Strategy Simulation Center hummed with the kind of self-important energy that only comes from gathering the universe's most intellectually superior beings in one ridiculously expensive room. Holographic displays flickered against walls made from compressed neutron star material, because apparently regular walls weren't pretentious enough for an institution that charged more credits per semester than most planets' gross domestic products. Commander Blix Netherton surveyed his classroom with the satisfaction of someone who had never encountered a tactical problem he couldn't solve with a combination of superior firepower and condescending lectures. His crystalline exoskeleton caught the light from 17 different suns, each ray carefully calculated to remind his students that he possessed both the intellectual capacity of a supercomputer and the military bearing of someone who had never actually seen real combat. The irony was lost on him naturally. "Welcome," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of 300 years of military theory and precisely 0 years of practical experience, "to advanced xeno-warfare tactics. I trust you've all prepared your minds for enlightenment." The assembled students represented the cream of Galactic Society's military academies. There was Horth, whose species had evolved from pack hunters on a world where cooperation meant survival and whose idea of strategy involved elaborate team formations that looked impressive on paper. Beside him sat Yenna, whose people had spent millennia perfecting the art of technological superiority, believing that every military problem could be solved by adding more energy weapons and shinier armor. Then there was Alex, whose aquatic species had developed warfare concepts based on fluid dynamics and three-dimensional thinking, though their actual combat experience consisted mainly of very polite disagreements over territory boundaries. And then, tucked away in the corner like an afterthought, sat the human. She appeared utterly unremarkable by galactic standards. No exotic exoskeleton, no naturally occurring energy manipulation abilities, no evolutionary advantages beyond opposable thumbs and what their admission file diplomatically termed persistent. Her species had only achieved faster-than-light travel within the last century, making them the cosmic equivalent of the kid who showed up to advanced calculus still counting on their fingers. Commander Netherton had reviewed her file with the kind of academic curiosity usually reserved for studying primitive civilizations. Humans were fascinating in the way that ancient bacteria were fascinating. Simple, hardy, and completely out of their depth in modern galactic society. Their homeworld was a disaster waiting to happen, spinning through space with an unstable climate, active geology, and an ecosystem that seemed designed by a committee of sadists. Yet somehow they had not only survived but thrived, which made them an interesting case study in evolutionary stubbornness. Today, Netherton continued, his tone suggesting he was about to bestow the secrets of the universe upon unworthy minds. "We will be conducting a tactical simulation, nothing too complex for our newer students." His gaze swept meaningfully toward the human corner. "Just a simple trench warfare scenario." The other students exchanged knowing glances. Trench warfare was considered the most primitive form of military engagement, something their species had evolved past millennia ago. It was the kind of basic exercise usually reserved for first-year students who still thought that pointing weapons at enemies and hoping for the best constituted strategy. Netherton activated the central holographic display, and suddenly the room was filled with the three-dimensional representation of a battlefield that would have made their ancestors proud and their current selves slightly embarrassed. Parallel trenches stretched across a pockmarked landscape, separated by a stretch of ground that tactical manuals politely referred to as no man's land and common sense called a very good place to die quickly. The objective, Netherton explained with the enthusiasm of someone describing how to operate a primitive tool, is simple. Your forces must advance from your defensive position and capture the enemy trenches while minimizing casualties and maximizing tactical efficiency. Horth's pack-hunting instincts were already calculating coordinated assault patterns. Yenna was mentally cataloging which energy weapons would most effectively neutralize fixed positions. Alex was considering the fluid dynamics of troop movement across open terrain. The human was staring at the holographic mud. "Now then," Netherton said, settling back into his position with the confidence of someone who had never been surprised by anything more challenging than a pop quiz. "Who would like to demonstrate the proper application of modern tactical doctrine to this rather straightforward scenario?" Every hand shot up except one. The human continued examining the simulated battlefield, with the intensity of someone reading a particularly dense technical manual, occasionally tilting her head as if listening for something the others couldn't hear. Netherton's crystalline features arranged themselves into what his species considered a smile but what most others interpreted as a threat display. Excellent. We'll proceed in order of tactical sophistication, which means another meaningful glance toward the corner. We'll work our way up to the more traditional approaches. The other students chuckled appreciatively. There was something delicious about watching a primitive species attempt to compete with evolutionarily superior intellects, like watching a fish try to climb a tree. Educational in its way, and mildly entertaining. The human finally looked up from her examination of the battlefield, caught Netherton's gaze, and simply nodded. No nervous energy, no visible anxiety about performing in front of beings whose species had been conducting interstellar warfare since before her planet had developed written language. Just quiet attention, as if she were absorbing some lesson that hadn't been taught yet. Netherton found her composure mildly irritating. Primitive species were supposed to be either intimidated by superior intellects, or blissfully ignorant of their own inadequacy. This calm assessment suggested neither, which didn't fit neatly into any of his academic categories. Very well then, he announced, making a note to include the human's performance in his next paper on the psychological limitations of pre-spaceflight civilization. Let us begin with a proper demonstration of how advanced tactical thinking approaches classical warfare scenarios. The simulation hummed to life, ready to showcase the vast gulf between primitive instinct and enlightened military science. Netherton settled back to observe what promised to be a thoroughly educational exercise in comparative tactical development. He had no idea he was about to receive an education himself. The holographic battlefield materialized with the kind of painstaking detail that justified the Academy's exorbitant tuition fees. Every clod of simulated mud had been rendered with scientific precision, every strand of razor wire calculated to exact specifications, every shell crater positioned according to authentic historical data that some unfortunate research assistant had spent months compiling from primitive archives. Commander Netherton gestured toward the display with the flourish of a conductor preparing to direct a symphony, though in his case the music would consist entirely of the sweet sound of his own voice, explaining obvious concepts to obviously inferior minds. As you can observe, we have a classic static defensive scenario. Two parallel trench systems separated by approximately 400 meters of open ground, scattered obstacles, and various hazards designed to impede direct assault. The battlefield stretched before them like a three-dimensional textbook illustration of everything wrong with primitive warfare. The trenches themselves were marvels of inefficiency, zigzagging lines of mud and misery that spoke to a species too technologically backward to simply hover above their problems or dissolve them with energy weapons. Between the opposing positions lay a wasteland that tactical historians called the killing field, with the kind of grim poetry that suggested they'd never actually had to cross one. Horth stepped forward first, his pack hunter instincts already coordinating assault formations that would have made his ancestors proud and his current professors moderately impressed. The solution is coordination, he announced, manipulating the holographic interface with practiced efficiency. Multiple synchronized advances from different angles, overwhelming the enemy's ability to respond to all threats simultaneously. The simulation sprang to life as Horth's forces advanced in perfect formation, their movements a testament to millions of years of evolutionary cooperation. Wave after wave of soldiers moved across the simulated battlefield in carefully orchestrated patterns, using suppression fire and tactical coordination to establish firing positions and gradually close the distance to the enemy trenches. It was textbook perfect. It was also exactly what every military academy in the galaxy taught as the proper solution to this scenario. The enemy forces responded predictably, casualties mounted on both sides in mathematically precise ratios, and after 17 minutes of perfectly executed tactics, Horth's forces achieved their objective within 7. Excellent, Netherton commented, making notes on his datapad with the satisfaction of a professor whose student had just recited a lesson exactly as taught. A classic application of coordinated assault doctrine. Casualties within acceptable parameters, objective achieved within expected timeframes. Yena's approach represented the logical evolution of military thinking beyond such pedestrian concerns as coordination and acceptable casualties. Her species had long ago concluded that the best way to handle defensive positions was to remove them from existence entirely, preferably from a safe distance, using weapons that made the target area briefly resemble the surface of a star. Overwhelming technological superiority, she declared, her energy manipulators dancing across the control interface with the grace of someone who had never considered that problems might exist which couldn't be solved by applying more power. Why risk personnel when you can simply eliminate the battlefield? Her simulation unfolded like a demonstration of why primitive species shouldn't attempt to fight advanced civilization. Energy bombardments turned defensive positions into glowing craters. Force field projectors created safe corridors for advancing troops, and hover platforms carried soldiers safely above the hazards that had claimed so many of Horth's forces. The enemy trenches were systematically erased from existence, along with most of the surrounding terrain. Victory was achieved in 8 minutes and 37 seconds with a 94.7% survival rate, though the phrase survival rate seemed somewhat academic when discussing an engagement where the enemy had been reduced to component atoms. Impressive application of technological advantages, Netherton noted approvingly, though perhaps slightly resource-intensive for a training exercise. Alex's turn represented the pinnacle of three-dimensional tactical thinking, an approach that treated warfare as a fluid dynamic problem, rather than a simple matter of pointing weapons and hoping for favorable outcomes. His aquatic species had spent eons perfecting the art of movement in environments where up, down, and sideways were merely suggestions rather than tactical limitations. The enemy expects linear thinking, Alex explained, his tentacles weaving complex patterns through the holographic interface. But battlefield control extends in all dimensions, including psychological space. His forces flowed across the battlefield like intelligent liquid, using underground tunnels, aerial insertion, and coordinated feints to attack from directions the enemy hadn't considered defending. It was beautiful in its complexity, elegant in its execution, and thoroughly convincing in its demonstration that primitive two-dimensional thinking was no match for evolved spatial reason. Victory came in 12 minutes, with an 88.3% survival rate, and significantly less collateral damage than Yena's approach, though considerably more confusion among the defending forces, who found themselves being attacked from directions they hadn't known existed. Fascinating, Netherton commented, genuinely pleased with the demonstration. An excellent example of how advanced spatial reasoning creates tactical opportunities that simpler species cannot perceive. 3 demonstrations of galactic military superiority, 3 decisive victories, 3 different approaches that all confirmed what everyone already knew. Primitive warfare was no match for evolved tactical thinking. The students basked in the satisfaction of intellectual superiority, confirmed, secure in the knowledge that they represented the pinnacle of military evolution. And then it was the human's turn. She approached the control interface with the same unhurried composure she'd maintained throughout the other demonstrations. But now Netherton noticed something he'd missed before. While the others had been conducting their textbook perfect assaults, she'd been watching the battlefield itself, not the troop movements or tactical formations, but the terrain, the defensive positions, the environmental details that everyone else had dismissed as background scenery. "Before I begin," she said, her voice carrying none of the confident certainty that had marked the other presentations, "I have a few questions about the parameters." Netherton's crystalline features arranged themselves into what he hoped looked like patience, rather than condescension. Primitive species always needed clarification about concepts that advanced minds grasped instinctively. Of course, what aspects of this straightforward scenario require explanation? "The weather patterns," she said, studying the display with the intensity of someone reading fine print in a contract. "What's the seasonal temperature variation? Precipitation patterns, wind direction and strength?" The other students exchanged glances. Weather in a tactical simulation. This was like asking about the dietary preferences of the holographic soldiers. "The simulation includes standard environmental parameters," Netherton replied,
his tone suggesting that such details were beneath the notice of proper tactical thinking. Temperature, humidity, precipitation, all within normal ranges for terrestrial combat environments, and the soil composition, drainage characteristics, water table depth. Now the glances carried hints of amusement. The primitive species was worried about mud consistency, while advanced civilizations were discussing three-dimensional force projection and energy weapon deployment patterns. Standard battlefield conditions, Netherton assured her, making another note for his research paper. Here was a perfect example of how limited cognitive capacity led to focus on irrelevant details, rather than strategic thinking. The human nodded and turned back to the controls. One more question. The defending forces, what's their supply situation? Morale indicate, how long have they been in position? Netherton's patience was beginning to fray around the edges like cheap fabric. The enemy forces represent a standard defensive formation, with adequate supplies and normal morale parameters. Is there some aspect of the tactical situation that you find confusing? She looked at him with an expression that might have been sympathy, but could just as easily have been something else entirely. No, sir, I think I understand the situation perfectly. The human placed her hands on the control interface, and for the first time since entering the classroom, she smiled.
What happened next would later be studied in military academies across 17 star systems, though the official reports would diplomatically describe it as an unconventional application of psychological warfare principles, rather than what it actually was. A masterclass in why underestimating humans was roughly equivalent to juggling antimatter while blindfolded. The humans' forces began their advance, and immediately everything the other students thought they knew about tactical simulation flew out the nearest airlock. Instead of the coordinated charges, energy bombardments or fluid-dimensional attacks they'd witnessed, her troops moved with what could charitably be called restraint, and what everyone else was beginning to recognize as something far more unsettling. Interesting opening, Netherton commented, though his tone suggested he found it about as interesting as watching paint dry on a particularly boring planet. Rather conservative in scope. The human soldiers weren't charging across no man's land or establishing firing positions or doing any of the things that proper military forces were supposed to do when faced with enemy trenches. Instead, they were digging. Not advancing, not attacking, just digging with the methodical persistence of a species that had apparently decided the best way to approach warfare was to treat it like an extremely violent construction project. What exactly is your tactical objective? Horth asked, his pack-hunting instincts completely baffled by an approach that seemed to involve no hunting whatsoever, and a disturbing amount of manual labor. Patience, the human replied, her attention focused on the holographic display where her forces continued their inexplicable excavation project. Good things come to those who wait. This was not the kind of answer that advanced military minds found satisfying. Yenna's energy manipulators twitched with the barely suppressed urge to simply vaporize whatever the human was trying to accomplish, while Alex's tentacles coiled in confusion at tactical thinking that appeared to have no discernible direction in any spatial dimension. But then the human's forces began doing something that made even less sense than digging. They started making noise, not the organized cacophony of battle but deliberate, patterned sounds that seemed to serve no tactical purpose whatsoever. Drums beating irregular rhythms, horns sounding at odd intervals, voices calling out in languages that the translation software couldn't quite parse. Is this some form of primitive communication system? Netherton asked, his academic curiosity momentarily overriding his growing irritation. Are your forces attempting to coordinate through audio signals? The human shook her head, still wearing that unsettling smile. Not quite. Think of it more as, the enemy forces in the simulation were beginning to react to this bizarre behavior in ways that the tactical computers hadn't been programmed to anticipate. Defensive positions that should have been maintaining disciplined readiness were showing signs of confusion, uncertainty, and what the monitoring systems diplomatically labeled as decreased operational efficiency. Your enemy appears to be experiencing morale degradation, Alex observed, his spatial reasoning struggling to map the three-dimensional implications of psychological warfare. Though I fail to understand how random excavation and noise production achieves this tactical objective. It's not random, the human said, her fingers dancing across the control interface with increasing confidence. Every species has patterns, Evolutionary reflexes, fears that go deeper than conscious. Her forces had stopped digging and started doing something that made even less tactical sense. They were playing games, singing, laughing, engaging in behavior that suggested they were having the time of their lives while crouched in muddy holes within rifle range of entrenched enemy. It was either the most advanced psychological operation anyone had ever witnessed, or evidence that humans were too stupid to understand when they should be terrified. The enemy forces were now displaying what military analysts call significant behavioral anomalies, and what anyone with common sense would recognize as the early stages of panic. Soldiers were abandoning positions, officers were issuing contradictory orders, and the entire defensive line was beginning to show cracks that had nothing to do with energy weapons or coordinated assaults. "I don't understand," Yenna admitted, her technological superiority suddenly feeling less superior than usual. "Your forces haven't engaged in direct combat, haven't utilized advanced weaponry, haven't even attempted to breach the enemy defensive perimeter. How are you achieving tactical advantage?" The human's smile widened. "We're not attacking their positions, we're attacking their assumptions." Her forces began the next phase of their incomprehensible strategy. They started not retreating, not repositioning, just casually walking away from the battlefield as if they'd suddenly remembered more important appointments elsewhere. They left behind their weapons, their equipment, their carefully constructed positions, everything except small packages that the tactical computers couldn't quite identify. "Are you surrendering?" Horth asked, his pack-hunting instincts completely unable to process the concept of voluntary withdrawal in the face of tactical advantage. "No," the human replied, her attention now focused entirely on the enemy trenches, where something very interesting was beginning to happen. "I'm letting them think." The enemy forces were indeed thinking, and the conclusions they were reaching were not conducive to maintaining defensive discipline. Soldiers were staring at the abandoned positions, trying to understand why an enemy would simply walk away from a battle they seemed to be winning. Officers were attempting to maintain order while dealing with questions that had no answers in any tactical manual. And then the packages left behind began to make sense. They weren't weapons or surveillance equipment or any form of advanced technology. They were gifts, food, small personal items, tokens of respect and friendship, all carefully selected to suggest that the approaching army viewed their enemies not as targets to be eliminated, but as future neighbors to be welcomed. The psychological impact was devastating. "Brilliant," Netherton whispered, his crystalline features reflecting a dawning understanding that was equal parts admiration and horror. "You're not conducting warfare at all. You're conducting diplomacy through the medium of psychological manipulation." The human turned from the control interface, her expression now carrying the weight of something that advanced civilizations had forgotten in their rush toward technological solutions. "Commander, with respect, we've been conducting warfare since before we discovered fire. We didn't evolve past it when we developed better weapons, we evolved it into better warfare." The enemy trenches were now experiencing what military historians would later classify as spontaneous tactical dissolution. Entire sections were abandoning their positions, not because they'd been defeated, but because they could no longer remember why they were supposed to be fighting an enemy that refused to act like an enemy. "But how?" Alex asked, his three-dimensional thinking struggling to map the implications of four-dimensional psychological manipulation. The human's answer was delivered with the casual confidence of someone explaining basic arithmetic to gifted children. "Because we've fought everyone. Every possible enemy. Every conceivable threat. Every variation of organized violence that evolution can produce. We fought each other for so long that we understand war the way you understand breathing." The simulation timer showed that 14 minutes had elapsed. No shots had been fired in the last 7 minutes. The enemy trenches were now completely empty, their defenders having made the rational decision that fighting an incomprehensible enemy was less appealing than finding somewhere else to be. Commander Netherton stared at the battlefield display, his superior intellect trying to process what had just occurred. "You've achieved total victory without engaging in combat." "No, sir," the human corrected gently. "I've achieved total victory by engaging in the only combat that actually matters." The silence that followed was the kind of profound quiet that usually occurs when fundamental assumptions about the universe suddenly reveal themselves to be as reliable as a chocolate teapot. Commander Netherton's crystalline exoskeleton had stopped reflecting the carefully calculated light from 17 different suns, and was now casting shadows that seemed to mirror his rapidly deflating intellectual superiority. He approached the control interface with the determined stride of someone who refused to believe that 3 centuries of military education could be rendered obsolete by a species that had only recently figured out which end of a spaceship was supposed to point forward. "There must be some error in the simulation parameters," he announced, his voice carrying the desperate conviction of a professor whose life's work was crumbling around him like a sandcastle in a tsunami. His manipulators danced across the controls, calling up detailed analyses, casualty reports, tactical assessments, anything that might explain how a textbook scenario had somehow transformed into a demonstration of why textbooks were apparently written by beings who had never met an actual human. "Enemy force disposition," he read aloud, his tone growing increasingly strained with each data point. 0 casualties, 0 equipment losses, 0 tactical defeats. Current status. His voice trailed off as he encountered a classification that the Academy's expensive simulation computers had never been programmed to display. Current status. Voluntarily relocated to alternative positions due to existential uncertainty regarding operational parameters. The display helpfully provided, which was the most polite way possible of saying that an entire army had decided that discretion was the better part of valor and had wandered off to contemplate life choices. Netherton's superior intellect was making the kind of grinding noises usually associated with primitive machinery attempting to process concepts beyond its design specification. By understanding the enemy better than they understand themselves, the humans suggested helpfully. "That's not warfare," Netherton protested, his crystalline features arranged in an expression of academic outrage that would have been impressive if it hadn't been so thoroughly misplaced. That's psychology," Yenna finished, her energy manipulators hanging limply as she contemplated the uncomfortable possibility that superior technology might not be the ultimate solution to every problem after all. "Diplomacy," added Alex, his tentacles coiling and uncoiling as his 3-dimensional thinking struggled to incorporate the concept of 4-dimensional manipulation through strategic nonviolence. "Cheating," concluded Horth, whose pack-hunting instincts were filing a formal complaint with evolution regarding the apparent inadequacy of coordinated assault tactics against enemies who refused to participate in being coordinated against. The human's smile had evolved from confident to sympathetic, as if she were watching particularly bright children work through a problem that adults had long since accepted as unsolvable. "Commander, may I ask you a question?" Netherton nodded, his intellectual pride still smarting but his curiosity beginning to override his wounded ego. After all, he was first and foremost a scholar, and what he'd just witnessed represented either the most significant advancement in military theory since the invention of the energy weapon, or evidence that his entire career had been based on fundamental misunderstandings about the nature of conflict. "How long has your species been conducting interstellar warfare?" "Approximately 8,000 standard years," Netherton replied, his voice carrying the weight of a civilization that had perfected the art of organized violence across multiple star systems. "And before that, planetary conflicts for roughly 15,000 years. We achieved military supremacy over our homeworld through superior tactical coordination and advanced weaponry." The human nodded as if she were taking notes for a research paper on comparative evolutionary development. "So your species has been fighting organized warfare for approximately 23,000 years total?" "Correct," Netherton confirmed, though he was beginning to suspect that this line of questioning was leading somewhere he wouldn't enjoy visiting. "Humans have been fighting each other for approximately 300,000 years," the human said conversationally, as if she were discussing the weather rather than revealing why her species approached conflict with the casual confidence of beings who had perfected every possible variation of organized violence before most civilizations had discovered agriculture. The implications hit the assembled students like a neutron star falling on a house of cards. 300,000 years of warfare meant that humans had been conducting tactical innovations, psychological operations, strategic deception, and every conceivable form of military evolution, while other species were still trying to figure out how to make fire without burning down their own caves. "But surely," Yenna protested, her technological superiority complex making one last desperate stand against the mounting evidence, "primitive warfare is nothing compared to advanced energy weapons and space-based tactical systems." The human's expression grew thoughtful, as if she were considering how to explain calculus to someone who was still struggling with basic arithmetic. "Tell me,
What's the most effective weapon ever developed? Fusion warheads, Yenna replied immediately. Plasma cannons, suggested Hort. Gravitational manipulators, offered Alex. Netherton consulted his mental database of military hardware. Quantum disruptors, obviously. The human shook her head. Ideas. The most effective weapon ever developed is the ability to convince your enemy that fighting you is a mistake. Everything else is just expensive ways of making the same point. She gestured toward the holographic display, where the empty trenches served as a three-dimensional monument to the power of psychological manipulation over brute force. Your approaches were all variations on the same theme. Apply superior capability until the enemy stops resisting. My approach was to convince them that resistance was pointless before it began. But how do you scale such tactics? Netherton asked, his academic mind already racing ahead to implications that stretched far beyond classroom simulations. How do you apply psychological warfare to interstellar conflicts involving millions of combatants across multiple star systems? The human smile returned, and this time it carried implications that made the assembled aliens suddenly very grateful that their species had developed faster than light travel after humans had discovered the concept of diplomacy. Commander, why do you think humanity joined the Galactic Council so quickly after achieving spaceflight? Why do you think we were so eager to participate in joint military exercises and educational exchanges? The answer hit Netherton like a revelation wrapped in a night. You're not learning our tactics. You're studying us. Every species has patterns. The human confirmed. Evolutionary reflexes. Cultural assumptions. Technological dependencies. Given enough time and observation, any enemy becomes predictable. The question isn't whether we can apply these techniques to interstellar warfare. The question is whether we'll need to. She stepped back from the control interface and faced the class with the bearing of someone who had just delivered the most important lesson they would ever receive. 300,000 years of warfare taught my species one fundamental truth. The best victory is the one where nobody has to die. But if somebody does have to die, we've had considerably more practice making sure it isn't us. Commander Netherton stared at the empty trench, his crystalline features reflecting the sobering realization that the primitive species in the corner represented not an academic curiosity, but a demonstration of why the universe's self-proclaimed military superior civilizations had been unknowingly living on borrowed time. Your move, Commander, the human said gently. He looked at the simulation controls, then at the empty battlefield, then at the quiet confidence in her eyes, and made perhaps the wisest tactical decision of his career. Class dismissed, he announced. I believe we all have some studying to do. As the students filed out, discussing in hushed tones the implications of what they'd witnessed, Netherton remained behind, staring at the holographic display where empty trenches served as a monument to the difference between fighting wars and understanding. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice was suggesting that perhaps the Academy's next semester should include a course on human military history, just in case.